Morning. Today's conference centers on the theme of creativity and passion and leadership. All good qualities, right? And yet, I think we would agree that in and of themselves, they're not enough to sustain us. For we've all seen passion be skewed by anger and fear. We've seen our political leaders become skewed, period. And we've seen how quickly creativity can become stale and devolve into something more like advertising or propaganda when it's not coming from a place of human connection, of authenticity. I think we would agree that we don't want to just be led anywhere, but to reach forward for a better place, we need to come from a place of empathy. My earliest memory is of the power of art and empathy. I remember being just 5 years old in Montessori school where you could choose your own work, a good method. And I often chose to draw maps and draw anything. And I remember working at the easel when what seemed to be just beautiful swirling shapes of color suddenly began to look like continents. And the continents began to look like a map of the world. And along one side of the picture, some swirls of color started to look like a figure, a smiling giant who seemed to stand and look out over all creation. And I felt good. And I wanted to take this picture home to my parents. So I went home, and my parents had been fighting. And in fact, a few years later, they got divorced. But in that moment, when I shared my art with them, their faces lit up. And we were, all three of us, transported to another place. And for the first time in my life, I felt that I had something to give them that they didn't already have. I felt it wasn't just about me. It was about a transformative experience, seeing the world in a new way, seeing each other in a new way. I was lucky that my parents were very supportive. My father gave me an easel, and this is my first studio next to the furnace. It looks cramped, but there was lots of space in the picture. Back then in the late 60s and early 70s, we just had a little black and white TV, but in art, it was in color. And the channels were limitless. I painted for pleasure, for the love of it, the passion. But as I grew up, I never thought of going into the arts as a career because I began to absorb some debilitating notions about art. As it turned out, it seemed that many of the artists were white, male Europeans, or of recent European descent. And not only that, it seemed that all the stories I heard about artists were that they were narcissistic, heavy drinking, chain smoking womanizers, not role models for me. Not only that, when I got to college, the textbooks were still full of white men, many of them great artists, of course, but where could a person of color or a woman or a person of any personality fit into that rubric? Yet somehow, after going down other avenues, I persisted in art, and it was partly because of my passion. But it was also because I began to meet real people, not myths, but real teachers and artists who worked not from that narcissistic place, but from a core of empathy, which allowed them to be open to new ideas and possibilities. So in the next few minutes, I want to share with you some art by people who are, for me, a different kind of model of creativity and passion and leadership, a model that can lead us to a place of greater communion with each other and with the environment. The first artist I want to share with you is Alice Lockhausen. I had the opportunity to curate an exhibit of many of her works about 15 years ago, and to meet this extraordinary artist and person. She is a survivor of the Holocaust, and in fact was interned not only at Guben, but at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen concentration camps. Incredibly, she survived and later went on to make works that commemorate her experience and memorialize those who did not survive. And this work, No Names, obviously shows those tracks leading not to shelter, but to a place of darkness where Nazis systematically stripped people of their identities and gave them numbers, taking humanity, turning it to numbers, and then to ashes. And it was so moving to work with her and to see her incredible art, which must be appreciated in person. So I will share with you a story she told me, which is incredibly, her first artwork ever was made in Guben, where as a teenager she had been brought, separated from her family in Hungary. She'd seen her mother and brother taken away and murdered. And there she is with other children, barracks of children. And the guards, incredibly, challenged each barracks to compete against each other for who would make the best Christmas decorations. Imagine. And of course, they didn't have enough to eat, let alone crayons or paper. But instead of despairing, which may have been the guards' intent, to create despair, she responded with art. She went to the one thing in the room, which was a broom, and she took strands of straw, and she gave each child a strand of straw to hold, like the wick of a candle. And she organized the children into a human candelabra. So when the guards returned, full of that darkness, the hatred, none of us can imagine that kind of place they must have been, but they were confronted, and the children embraced an image of light and of transcendence, of hope, that image of everlasting communion with each other and with higher powers that is at the center of so many world religions. And that was her gift in that moment to her community, and it's just one example of the many gifts she brought to others and to her artwork subsequently. Another artist I want to share with you who confronts both the darkness that's in the world, our capacity for destruction, but also our capacity to create and discover light within ourselves and within each other. This artist is Emmet Gowan, an esteemed American photographer, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to exhibit his work as well. And this image, Nancy, Danville, Virginia, is just one of many pictures he took of his family, his extended family. And they're portraits that when he made them in the 70s and he gained acclaim for them, they're from the everyday, and yet they capture something timeless and universal. I love the way this girl is wrapped in a moment of complete reverie, of oneness with herself and with nature. Her arms intertwine in a way that seems to form a symbol of infinity, and those eggs in her hands seem to contain multitudes. They seem to hold the promise of all future creation within them. To capture such work seems easy. Pop out a camera, but no, it requires a kind of attentiveness to the moment that takes years, decades to develop. And he's attentive to images that expand his own perspective and horizon. This is another image by Gowan of Hanford nuclear reservation, that site where in 1943 the US began producing plutonium for the first nuclear bombs, the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, and many others that were stockpiled. And this is where he discovered we had once a city of 30,000 workers laboring to create plutonium. 53 million gallons of radioactive waste were stored there, many of it leaking into the ground and contaminating 200 square acres of underground water right there by our river. And seeing such things and trying to fathom their meaning amid the beauty of the surrounding vista made him want to explore other areas where we have altered the world forever. We've created and sculpted the land in ways that signal both our ingenuity and our capacity for annihilation. This is Sedan crater number 10, another number, in the Nevada Proving Ground, which is the site where we've conducted, in this site alone on Yucca Flat, over 700 nuclear tests above and below ground. And he shows in this image, which is really, you see it on the screen, but it's small. You could hold it in your hand and reflect on its beauty, the raking light, the patterns of circles, the tracery of off-road vehicles looking like a brushstroke or a drawing stroke. Yet it shows how we have the capacity to turn the earth into a moonscape. And yet, after gaining acclaim for this body of work, he moves on. And he's looking not at the expansive view from above, but up close at the myriad wonders of creation. And in this series, the Mariposas Nocturna series, which he's involved in now, he's creating index sheets of images of moths that are visible only for fleeting moments at night. And different times of year they appear, and if you're attentive, you may see them. If you work hard, you may collect and study and name them. There's a kind of scientific quality to his gathering and naming and arranging of these images, but he reminds us in this and other works that we never understand the world except through our own particular lens. And that lens is an aesthetic lens. It's a lens, anything we use to understand the world is informed by our sense of beauty. And he's returned in this portrait, Edith and Mothflight, to the family and integrating what he's learned about moths and the study of them with his knowledge of what he loves most. And in this image, where the moth flight is captured through a slow shutter speed, you see these arcing halos of light surrounding Edith, like emanations of thought, like the embodiment of spirit. These remind me of the arcing halos of light that I've always admired in the work of Charles Birchfield. I've always loved his work, grew up looking at it, and this painting, Mist Phantoms at Dawn, may seem fantastical, hallucinatory, wholly invented. But to me, it's very true to the experience of nature, not just its appearance, but how we feel in nature, how the sounds of the crickets or the peeper frogs are in the woods, sometimes teeming with sound. My experience of the Connecticut woods, where I grew up, profoundly affected my sense of both art and community and way of being in the world. And Birchfield's ideas and the reality of the complexity of nature formed a kind of aesthetic, an appreciation for complexity. And I love the way I took this as a teenager, not to make an artwork, but to pay attention to what had just happened. The snow revealed branches and traceries of complexity that I hadn't seen before. And it also concealed so much. So art was showing me, helping me see how to look more deeply and be attentive in each moment. And these woods were a refuge for me, and still are. They're the landscape of my memory, and these woods have since been ruined through development. But as I work in my own studio, and this is one of my works, it is a 6-foot-tall carved and inked wood panel triptych called Midnight Glory. I often work at midnight when the kids are asleep. And as I delve into the wood, carving into it, I'm responding to the wood grain right there from my materials, and I'm also thinking about what I treasure in nature. Some of it is lost to development, but so much of it is there to be treasured and preserved and reflected upon. The textures of nature are very real to me. And the cacophony and complexity are things that we can't capture in an advertising logo. It's a journey. And I never look at nature without thinking about community. And the complexity of this crazy quilt made by my great-grandmother comes from the fact that it was made by many hands. And I've had the opportunity to be part of a quilting group for many years where wisdom and experience have been imparted to me by my dear friends, along with scraps of fabric. And gradually, naturally, scraps of fabric have begun finding their way into my own artwork. This is another image. And like Emmet, and like so many artists, I don't try to make every work look like the others and make it a product. This is called cornucopia. It's a mixed media image of the fullness I see in nature. And in it are scraps of fabric from friends. And this is called Uprooted. This is a picture I made when my family was uprooted. My mother had suffered a brain aneurysm several years ago, and although she survived, we quickly realized we needed to move her from her home of 45 years and where those beautiful woods had been. We needed to move from that place and bring her to a place where she could have more support. And in letting go of things, of furniture, of art, all kinds of things, we also had to decide what could be preserved. And I think about how nature is built upon the mulch and litter of what's died and what's been lost, and how art too takes what's fallen apart and reassembles it in new ways, making it fresh, hopefully, for ourselves and for others. So this piece, Uprooted, takes its imagery from the landscape that I grew up in, but it incorporates fragments of my mother's dress and elements from friends, thinking about how uprooting is not just a place of loss, but also perhaps a new beginning. And this piece is called Inheritance, because as we were moving my mother, there was a play rug she had knotted for her grandchildren. And the grandchildren had all grown up, and no one wanted this rug, but it had been made with so much love and creativity and such an investment of time. So I thought, well, why not me? Why don't I play with it? So I cut it up, which is my way of play, and I used the back side of it. I used the front side. I combined it with collage elements, with pastel, and I thought of the aerial views of Emmet Gowan. And I thought about how the terrain, the landscape is like the terrain of our imagination. And we don't go there alone, we go there together. And as we look at the landscape, we have to think, what will it look like? How will we all reinvent it in the future? Thank you.